There's a stretch of blacktop just outside of Otto County, Nebraska, that still bears the deep, parallel gouges of a desperate man's last stand. It was the bitter autumn of 1978, a year the bank tried to swallow the Hawthorne farm whole, when Briggs Freight and Hauling severed their contract 12 hours before a hard foreclosure deadline, leaving £60,000 of premium winter wheat stranded in the mud. Parker Hawthorne didn't call a lawyer. He walked into his freezing barn, stared at a pair of aging, red International Harvester Farmall tractors, and decided that if the modern corporate world was going to leave him to rot, he was going to drag his salvation 40 miles through the dirt by his own damn hands. The wind howling off the Nebraska plains that October carried the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow. But to Parker Hawthorne, it just smelled like ruin. Parker was a man carved from the very dirt. He worked tall, heavily calloused, with eyes the color of faded denim that had seen 3 generations of Hawthorns bleed into the soil of their 400-acre spread. This year was supposed to be the resurrection. After 3 consecutive seasons of drought, hail, and a devastating blight, the earth had finally yielded. The winter wheat crop was a staggering success, a golden ocean that promised to wipe the ledger clean with the First National Bank of Omaha. The deal was locked tight. Thomas Henderson, the unforgiving but fair broker who ran the massive grain elevators down at the Lincoln railhead, had drawn up the contract. Henderson needed £60,000 of premium wheat to fill an outbound Union Pacific freight train heading to the coast. The deadline was midnight on Thursday. If the wheat wasn't in Henderson's silos by the time the clock struck 12, the contract was void. The train would leave empty, and the bank would seize the Hawthorne farm at 8:00 a.m. Friday morning. Parker had done everything right. The wheat was harvested, dried, and loaded into a colossal 40-foot tandem axle hopper trailer sitting at the edge of his property. All he needed was the truck. A month prior, Parker had contracted Clayton Briggs, the slick-haired owner of Briggs Freight and Hauling, to provide the heavy-duty semi-truck to haul the massive load the 40 miles down Highway 34 to Lincoln. Briggs had taken a hefty deposit and shook Parker's hand, a gesture that, in Parker's world, was more binding than iron. But at 2:00 p.m. on Thursday, 10 hours before the deadline, the black rotary phone on the Hawthorne's kitchen wall rang. Martha Hawthorne, Parker's wife of 30 years, answered it. Her face went pale as she listened. She held the receiver out to Parker, her hand trembling slightly. "It's Clayton." Parker wiped grease from his hands with a rag and took the phone. "Briggs, you boys are late. My trailer is loaded to the brim, and the mud is starting to freeze. Tell your driver to put chains on." Parker, Clayton Briggs's voice crackled through the earpiece, smooth and completely devoid of guilt. "We've got a situation. I'm pulling the rig." The kitchen suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. "What the hell are you talking about, Clayton? We have a contract. That wheat has to be at Henderson's elevator by midnight." "Look, Parker, be reasonable," Briggs sighed, playing the victim. "The County Road Commission just issued a soft road warning. We got 2 inches of freezing rain last night. That county road leading from your farm to the highway is a swamp of thick, heavy clay. You've got £60,000 in that hopper. My dispatcher says if we put my Peterbilt on that dirt road, it'll sink to the axles, tear out the transmission, and likely jackknife before we even hit the pavement. My insurance underwriter caught wind of it and threatened to pull my coverage. I can't risk a $40,000 rig for your wheat." "You took my deposit," Parker roared, his knuckles turning white around the heavy plastic receiver. "You shook my hand. Briggs, you know damn well if this load doesn't make the railhead, the bank takes my land tomorrow morning. This farm has been in my family since 1892. It's just business, Hawthorne." The line went dead. Parker stood frozen, the dial tone buzzing in his ear like a hornet. He slowly hung up the phone. Martha didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. The silence in the kitchen was heavy enough to crush bone. "He's not coming," Parker whispered, staring at the linoleum floor. "Parker," Martha started, her voice breaking. She looked out the window at the massive, silver hopper trailer sitting a quarter-mile away at the edge of their drive, its tires already sinking an inch into the freezing Nebraska mud. "What do we do? Henderson won't wait." "He told you. The train leaves at 1:00 a.m. "I know what he told me," Parker said, turning toward the back door. He grabbed his heavy canvas Carhartt jacket from the peg. "Where are you going?" Martha asked. "I don't know yet," Parker muttered, pushing out into the freezing wind. "But I'll be damned if I let a slick-talking suit in an office and a little bit of mud take my grandfather's land." He walked the distance to the loaded trailer. It was a monster. 60,000 pounds of dense, golden grain packed into a steel shell. It was designed to be pulled by a 600-horsepower diesel semi-truck, a machine with 10 massive drive tires and gearing designed to move mountains. Parker kicked the heavy tire of the trailer. It didn't budge. The mud around it was thick, sucking clay, the kind of mud that swallowed boots and broke axles. Briggs was right about one thing. A standard highway truck would have a hell of a time pulling it out of this muck. But Parker wasn't a truck driver. He was a farmer, and farmers knew how to move dirt. Parker trudged from the loaded trailer toward his heavy machine shed. The tin roof rattled violently against the October gale. Inside, the shed was dark, smelling of diesel fuel, old grease, and damp earth. He flipped the breaker, and 4 long fluorescent tubes flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale light over the space. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor were his lifelines. On the left was his pride and joy, a 1,965 International Harvester Farmall 1,206 Turbo. It was a beast of a machine, the first row crop tractor to break the 100 horsepower mark, boasting a massive turbocharged diesel engine that sounded like a freight train when it idled. It was painted International Red, though the paint was chipped and worn from years of brutal labor. On the right sat the older workhorse, a Farmall 806. Not as powerful as the 1,206, but it possessed a low-end torque that could pull a stubborn oak stump out of frozen ground without breaking a sweat. It was heavier, wider, and completely mechanical. No computers, no delicate electronics, just cast iron, heavy gears, and pure diesel combustion. Parker walked between them, running his calloused hand over the cold steel fender of the 1,206. He did the math in his head. The hopper trailer weighed roughly 10,000 pounds empty. The wheat was 60,000. 70,000 pounds dead weight sitting in sucking mud. The Farmall 1,206 was rated to pull heavy plows and massive discs, but 70,000 pounds on a highway trailer, balanced on a fifth-wheel kingpin? It was suicide. Even if the tractor had the horsepower, it didn't have the weight. The moment he popped the clutch, the massive rear tires would just spin in the mud, digging the tractor a grave next to the trailer. If he miraculously got it onto the highway, the sheer weight of the trailer would push the tractor right off the road the second he hit a downhill grade. The tractor's brakes were designed for field work, not stopping a moving skyscraper of grain at 30 miles an hour. One tractor couldn't do it. Parker paused, his eyes darting between the 1,206 and the 806. But what if they pulled together? The thought was pure madness. It violated every safety manual, every state transportation law, and every law of common sense. Hitching 2 tractors together to pull a highway semi-trailer was the kind of desperate, drunken idea men laughed about at the local diner. But Parker wasn't laughing. He stared at the drawbars on the back of the tractors. If he hooked the 806 to the front of the 1,206 inches a tandem configuration, he would double his pulling power and, more importantly, double his braking weight. He would have 12 tons of cast iron and rubber gripping the road, backed by over 200 horsepower of raw, unadulterated diesel torque. But there was a fatal flaw in the plan. You couldn't just tie a rope between 2 tractors and pull a load like that. The synchronization had to be absolute. If the front tractor pulled too hard, it would rip the front axle right off the rear tractor. If the rear tractor pushed too hard, it would jackknife the front tractor into a ditch, crushing the driver. Furthermore, how would they attach a commercial fifth-wheel semi-trailer to an agricultural drawbar? He needed a mechanic. He needed a lunatic. He needed Dale Jenkins. Parker ran to the wall phone in the shop and dialed the number of his nearest neighbor. Dale was a retired county mechanic who spent his days rebuilding wrecked engines and hoarding scrap metal. "Dale, it's Parker," he barked the moment the line picked up. "Parker, it's 3 in the afternoon. Why aren't you celebrating your big payday?" Dale's gravelly voice replied. Briggs backed out, left the load in the dirt. "Bank takes the farm at 8:00 a.m. There was a heavy pause on the line. "Son of a bitch," Dale whispered. "What do you need? A lawyer? A shotgun? I got both. I need your welding rig, your acetylene torches, and every piece of half-inch structural steel you have laying in your scrap pile. Get over here now." "Parker, what the hell are you planning?" "I'm hitching the 1,200 and the 806 together in tandem. We're building a custom fifth-wheel dolly out of scrap, and we're hauling that load to Lincoln ourselves." Dale let out a low whistle. "Parker, that's 40 miles on Highway 34. The Department of Transportation catches you, they'll put you under the jail. Not to mention, rolling 70,000 pounds behind 2 farm tractors? If you hit the brakes wrong on that downhill grade near Waverly, that trailer is going to roll right over the top of you and crush you into a tin can." "I'm dead by morning anyway, Dale," Parker said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I'd rather die in the seat of my International than watch the bank auction off my grandfather's front porch. Are you coming or not? I'll be there in 10 minutes, Dale grunted. Put a pot of black coffee on. We're gonna need it. By 4:00 p.m., the Hawthorne machine shed looked like the inner rings of hell. Sparks showered down from the rafters in brilliant, blinding cascades as Dale Jenkins attacked a massive I-beam with a cutting torch. Dale had arrived in his rusted 1970 Chevy Shay 10, the bed groaning under the weight of his portable arc welder, heavy steel plating, and a salvaged fifth-wheel hitch plate he'd cut off a wrecked semi-truck a decade prior. The physics of this are an absolute nightmare, Parker, Dale yelled over the deafening hiss of the acetylene torch, his welding mask flipped up to reveal a soot-stained face. To tow a semi-trailer with a tractor, you need a dolly converter, an axle to carry the front weight of the trailer so it doesn't crush the tractor's suspension. I know, Parker shouted back, sliding out from under the back of the 1206. That's why we're taking the front axle off the old grain wagon out back. For the next 4 hours, the two men worked with a manic, desperate energy. They were fighting the clock. Every minute that ticked by brought the midnight deadline closer. They hauled the heavy front axle of an abandoned grain wagon into the shop. Using half-inch steel plate, they began fabricating a custom towing dolly. They welded the salvaged fifth-wheel hitch plate directly onto the heavy steel frame they built over the wagon axle. This contraption would lock into the trailer's kingpin, bearing the massive tongue weight of the load. Then came the hardest part, the tandem link. If we're going to tandem these tractors, Dale explained, wiping sweat from his eyes despite the freezing temperature outside, we need a rigid tow bar between the 806 and the 1206. No chains. If we use chains and the front tractor brakes, the rear tractor will rear-end it instantly. It has to be a solid steel connection. Parker looked around the shop. He didn't have any heavy steel tubing left. His eyes fell on the massive, load-bearing steel crossbeam that supported the loft of his machine shed. Without a word, Parker grabbed a reciprocating saw, climbed a ladder, and began cutting the support beam out of his own barn. You're taking down your own damn shed, Dale hollered. The bank owns the shed tomorrow anyway. Parker screamed over the noise of the saw. Catch it! The heavy steel beam crashed to the concrete floor. They measured it, cut it, and began welding heavy steel clevises to the ends. They pinned one end to the heavy cast-iron drawbar of the 806, the lead tractor, and the other to the front weight bracket of the 1206, the rear tractor. Now for the controls, Dale said, panting heavily. Who is driving what? I'll take the 1206 inches, the rear, Parker commanded. I need to be closest to the load to feel how the dolly is tracking. You drive the 806 up front. You're the steering. I'm the anchor. Parker, if we get out of sync by even a second. If I throttle up and you don't, I'll snap that tow bar. If you brake and I don't, you'll flip me. Then we don't get out of sync, Parker said, his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. We need a physical signal. A rope between the cabs. 1 pull for throttle up, 2 for gear change, a hard yank for emergency brake. It was primitive. It was incredibly dangerous. But it was all they had. By 8:00 p.m., the storm outside had worsened. The freezing rain had turned into a mix of sleet and heavy, wet snow. Inside the shed, the beast was finally assembled. The two tractors stood nose to tail like a massive, red mechanical dragon. The heavy steel beam linked them together, looking more like an instrument of war than agricultural equipment. Behind the 1206 sat their custom-forged dolly, the fifth-wheel plate heavily greased and ready to receive the immense weight of the 60,000-pound trailer. Fire 'em up, Parker ordered, climbing into the open-air cab of the 1206. Dale climbed onto the seat of the 806. He turned the key and hit the starter. The old diesel engine turned over slowly in the cold, coughing out a thick cloud of black smoke before roaring to life, its steady thrum-thrum-thrum shaking the tin walls of the shed. A moment later, Parker engaged the starter on the 1206. The massive turbocharged engine erupted with a deafening, whistling roar, an aggressive snarl that drowned out the howling wind outside. "Take us out, Dale," Parker yelled, pulling the makeshift signal rope once. Slowly, agonizingly, the two tractors rolled out of the shed into the freezing night. The custom tow beam held tight. They maneuvered the massive rig through the muddy yard, the deep lug tires of the Farmalls biting into the freezing clay. Martha stood on the back porch, a heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the surreal procession. The headlights of the tractors cut through the driving sleet like lighthouses in a turbulent sea. They reversed the contraption toward the stranded hopper trailer. Dale had to rely entirely on Parker's hand signals, visible only by the rear work lights of the 806. Parker backed the custom dolly perfectly under the lip of the trailer. Clang click. The heavy steel jaws of the fifth wheel locked around the trailer's kingpin. The sound echoed across the desolate farm like a prison door slamming shut. Parker jumped down and cranked the landing gear of the trailer up. He connected the makeshift pneumatic air lines Dale had rigged from a portable air compressor in the back of the 1206 to the trailer's air brakes. It wasn't perfect, but it would give them at least 1 or 2 solid stops before the air ran out. Parker walked up to the front tractor. The sleet was freezing to Dale's coat. "It's 8:30 p.m., Parker yelled over the roaring engines. "We have 3.5 hours to go 40 miles. If we keep it in high gear, road speed is about 18 miles an hour. If the mud doesn't stop us," Dale replied, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "If the hills don't kill us, and if the state troopers don't arrest us." Parker climbed up on the side of Dale's tractor, leaning in close. "We pull this off, Dale, I'm buying you steak dinners for a year. Just don't run me over, you stubborn son of a gun." Dale grinned nervously. Parker ran back through the mud and climbed into the seat of the 1206. He looked back at the massive silver wall of the trailer looming behind him, a 60,000-pound guillotine hanging over his life's work. He grabbed the signal rope. He gave it one sharp, hard yank, throttle up. The single, sharp yank on the hemp rope transferred from Parker's frozen glove through the freezing rain and straight into Dale's cab. Dale Jenkins took a deep breath, his breath pluming in the harsh glow of the dashboard gauges. He eased the heavy throttle lever forward on the Farmalls 806 and slowly let out the clutch. A split second later, Parker did the exact same in the 1206. The mechanical synchronization was a miracle of blind faith. 2 massive diesel engines roared in unison, spewing thick columns of black exhaust into the swirling snow. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The massive, deep-treaded rear tires of both tractors spun in the freezing Nebraska clay, screaming as the heavy rubber ground against the ice and mud. Then, the custom-welded hitch groaned. The half-inch structural steel of the dolly absorbed the shock, and the 60,000-pound trailer shuttered. With a sound like a ship tearing away from a frozen dock, the massive rig lurched forward. "Keep her straight, Dale! Keep her straight!" Parker screamed into the wind, though he knew Dale couldn't hear a word over the deafening mechanical symphony. The first mile was a nightmare. Otoe County Road 14 was a ribbon of unpaved, rain-soaked misery. Briggs's dispatcher had been absolutely right. A standard commercial semi-truck would have sunk to its axles within 50 feet. The mud was thick, sucking gumbo that wanted nothing more than to swallow the heavy hopper trailer whole. Parker gripped the steering wheel of the 1206 with white knuckles. He wasn't steering, Dale was doing all the navigating up front, but Parker had to use the tractor's independent rear wheel brakes to keep his machine perfectly aligned behind the 806. If the rear tractor drifted even a few inches out of the tracks laid by the front tractor, the rigid steel beam connecting them would act like a giant lever, violently twisting the 806 off the road. Every time the trailer's massive tandem axles hit a deep rut, the drag felt like they had hit a brick wall. The 1206's front tires would literally lift an inch off the ground as the torque fought the dead weight behind it. Halfway to the blacktop, disaster nearly struck. They hit a washed-out depression near the property line of the old Peterson spread. The front tires of Dale's 806 plunged into a foot-deep trench of icy water and clay. The tractor bogged down hard, the engine RPMs dropping drastically. Dale instinctively slammed his foot on the clutch to keep the engine from stalling. But Parker couldn't see the washout. He was blinded by the exhaust, the sleet, and the sheer size of the 806 inches front of him. He kept his throttle wide open. The 1206 surged forward. The heavy steel beam connecting the 2 tractors instantly bowed under the immense pressure. The rear tractor was literally trying to drive over the front tractor. Track. A terrifying metallic snap echoed over the roar of the engines. The 806 lurched violently to the right, the front wheels completely leaving the ground. Parker reacted with pure, panicked instinct. He slammed both boots onto the dual brake pedals of the 1206 and yanked the throttle back. The massive rear tires locked up, skidding through the mud, while the 60,000-pound trailer behind him shoved the custom dolly forward, threatening to jackknife the entire operation into the deep drainage ditch. The rig came to a shuddering, violent halt. The silence that followed was broken only by the whistling wind and the heavy, rhythmic idling of the 2 diesel engines. Parker threw the 1206 into neutral, set the parking brake, and vaulted out of the open-air cab into the knee-deep mud. He sprinted to the front. Dale was already out, shining a heavy aluminum flashlight on the connecting beam. He was shaking, though whether from the freezing cold or the adrenaline, Parker couldn't tell. "Did it break?" Parker gasped, wiping freezing rain from his eyes. "The main beam held," Dale shouted back, pointing the beam at the massive steel clevis joint attached to his drawbar. But the stress sheared one of the half-inch locking pins clean in half. "It's hanging by a single bolt, Parker. If you push me like that again, you're going to run right over my head." Parker stared at the bent pin. They were dead in the water, blocking a county road in a blizzard, with 70,000 pounds of dead weight sinking deeper into the mud by the second. "Do you have a spare pin in the truck?" Parker asked. "No, I brought what we needed for the build," Dale spat, looking at his watch. It was 9:45 p.m. "We're done, Parker. We can't pull this load with a compromised linkage." Parker refused to accept it. He looked around wildly, his eyes locked onto a heavy, rusted steel wrecking bar strapped to the side of the 806's toolbox. He grabbed it, then ran to the back of the 1206 and grabbed a 3-pound sledgehammer. "What are you doing?" Dale yelled. "Back up an inch," Parker commanded, shoving the wrecking bar into the hole where the sheared pin used to be. "Just ease it back to take the pressure off the joint." Dale hesitated, then climbed into the cab. He eased the tractor in reverse. The steel joint aligned. Parker raised the sledgehammer and brought it down on the thick steel wrecking bar with every ounce of desperate strength in his body. Sparks flew into the wet night. He hit it again, and again. He drove the thick steel bar through the heavy clevis, effectively replacing the broken pin with a solid wedge-driven chunk of iron. "It won't hold," Dale yelled down. "It has to," Parker roared back, tossing the hammer onto the floorboard of the 1206. He climbed back into his freezing seat. "2 yanks, Dale, we rocket out of this hole." On 3, Parker grabbed the rope. Yank. Yank. Both men threw their machines into their lowest crawler gears. They throttled up simultaneously, the diesels screaming in protest. The wrecking bar groaned, bending slightly under the immense torque, but the iron held. Slowly, agonizingly, the mud released its grip. The 806 clawed its way out of the washout, dragging the 1206, the custom dolly, and the mountain of wheat behind it. 10 minutes later, the violent shaking stopped. The tires finally bit into solid asphalt. They had reached Highway 34. The transition from the sucking mud to the hard blacktop of the state highway was a fleeting moment of victory. As the heavy lug tires of the farm tractors hit the asphalt, the violent vibrations smoothed out into a deep, rhythmic hum that vibrated through Parker's teeth. They were on the main vein to Lincoln, but the real danger had just begun. Highway 34 wasn't a flat ribbon. It cut through the rolling, glacial hills of eastern Nebraska. A tractor pulling a plow in a flat field is an exercise in traction. Pulling a 60,000-pound commercial trailer at 20 miles per hour on a public highway is a terrifying dance with physics and momentum. Dale shifted the 806 up through the gears, and Parker matched him perfectly, watching the exhaust stack of the front tractor to anticipate the shifts. They reached top road gear. 18 miles an hour. It felt like they were flying. The cold was absolute. The cabs of the 60S era tractors were entirely open to the elements. The sleet drove horizontally into Parker's face like tiny glass shards. He had pulled his wool cap down tight and wrapped a greasy shop rag around the lower half of his face, but his hands were going numb inside his heavy leather gloves. He kept his right hand hovering over the makeshift air brake valve that Dale had rigged up, and his left hand gripped the steering wheel, desperately keeping the 1206 tracking dead straight behind Dale. For the first 10 miles, they owned the night. The blizzard had driven everyone else off the road. They were a ghostly, mechanical beast roaring through the blackness. Then, they reached the crest of the Waverly Grade. It was a 2-mile descent that dropped sharply toward the Salt Creek Basin. Truckers knew to gear down and hit their Jake brakes before they even crested the hill. But Parker and Dale didn't have Jake brakes. They had agricultural drum brakes and the compression of 2 farm engines. As the 806 tipped over the crest, gravity took hold of the massive hopper trailer. 70,000 pounds of steel and grain surged forward. Parker felt the terrifying physical shove from behind. The trailer wasn't just rolling. It was pushing the 1206, which in turn shoved the solid steel beam directly into the back of the 806. The rope violently jerked in Parker's hand. One long, desperate pull. Dale's signal for brake. "We're going too fast." Parker stomped on the tractor brakes. The heavy cast-iron brake shoes clamped down, but the momentum of the trailer just pushed the massive, locked rear tires of the 1206 down the wet asphalt in a controlled skid. They were gaining speed, 20 miles an hour, 25. The engines were winding out, pushed past their governed limits by the sheer force of gravity driving the wheels. The 1206's turbocharger shrieked like a banshee. Parker reached for the makeshift air valve to trigger the trailer's commercial brakes. He yanked the lever. PSSSHHHHH. The compressed air from the small, gas-powered compressor strapped to the back of the 1206 rushed into the trailer's air lines. The trailer's massive drum brakes engaged. The entire rig violently shuddered, groaning as the speed scrubbed off. Parker watched the tachometer drop. They were regaining control. But then, the air pressure gauge on the makeshift tank plummeted. The small compressor, designed to inflate truck tires in a shop, was never meant to sustain the high-volume air demands of commercial semi-trailer brakes on a 2-mile downhill grade. The air tank emptied in seconds, the trailer brakes faded, the hissing stopped, and the weight surged forward again. No, 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 Parker muttered, panic rising in his chest. 30 miles an hour, the steering wheel of the 1206 began to shake violently. At this speed, on wet pavement, with agricultural tires, a jackknife was virtually guaranteed. If the trailer stepped out of line by even a degree, it would sweep sideways, flipping both tractors and crushing them instantly under 30 tons of wheat. Ahead of him, Parker could see the brake lights of the 806 flickering desperately. Dale was standing on his brakes, but it was like trying to stop a freight train with a bicycle. The rear of the 806 was starting to shimmy, pushed mercilessly by the rigid steel beam. If Dale loses steering, we're dead. Parker made a split-second, incredibly destructive decision. He couldn't stop the load with the brakes, so he had to use the engine. He clutched in, grabbed the heavy gear lever of the 1206, and with a brutal, grinding crunch of metal, he forced the transmission down 2 full gears into a low-range crawler gear. He dumped the clutch. The sudden mechanical resistance was catastrophic. The massive rear tires of the 1206 locked up, barking against the pavement in a cloud of blue tire smoke. The 1206's engine RPMs spiked violently, the needle burying itself in the red zone. The engine howled, a terrifying metallic scream of valves floating and pistons begging for mercy. The sudden, violent anchor of the 1206 violently jerked the 806 backward. The steel beam connecting them bowed upward, groaning under the incredible compression. But it worked. The sheer, mechanical drag of the massive, over-revving diesel engine fought the weight of the trailer. The speed began to drop. 25, 20, 15. The smell of burning rubber, roasting brake pads, and scorched transmission fluid filled the freezing air. The 1206 was vibrating so violently Parker thought the engine block was going to tear itself apart, sending shrapnel through the open cab. They hit the bottom of the Waverly Grade at 12 miles an hour, rolling onto the flat bridge over Salt Creek. Parker quickly pushed the clutch in, saving the engine from completely detonating, and shifted back up to match Dale's speed. His chest was heaving. He wiped a mixture of freezing rain and sweat from his eyes. Ahead, the taillights of the 806 blinked twice in rapid succession. It wasn't a rope signal. Dale was manually flashing the lights, a silent, desperate acknowledgement that they had just stared death in the face and blinked last. They had survived the hill, but Parker's eyes darted to the fuel gauge on the dashboard. The needle was bouncing dangerously close to the empty peg. The brutal fight through the mud and the high RPM engine braking had chewed through their diesel reserves faster than Parker had ever calculated. It was 10:30 p.m. They still had 15 miles of highway left, right through the heart of the county line, and they were running on fumes. The needle on the Farmall 1206's fuel gauge didn't just rest on the empty peg. It seemed to be trying to bury itself beneath it. Parker tapped the glass face of the gauge with a frozen, heavy leather glove, hoping it was just a stuck float in the tank. But the engine's slight hesitation told him the bitter truth. The massive turbocharged diesel was beginning to suck air. It was 10:45 p.m. The glow of Lincoln's city lights painted the low-hanging snow clouds an eerie, bruised purple ahead of them. They were down to the last 10 miles, but every rotation of those massive agricultural tires felt like drawing blood from a stone. Then, the night behind them fractured into terrifying shards of red and blue. Parker snapped his head around. Reflected in the polished aluminum of the hopper trailer was the unmistakable strobe of a police cruiser. It was a Lancaster County Sheriff's patrol car, fighting through the swirling sleet, riding dangerously close to the rear bumper of the trailer. The cruiser's siren wailed, a high, mechanical scream that cut through the roaring drone of the two tractors. The cruiser pulled out into the oncoming lane, which was thankfully empty due to the blizzard. and accelerated to pull alongside Parker's 1206. Parker looked down from his high, open-air seat. The window of the Plymouth Fury patrol car rolled down, revealing the furious face of Deputy Wayne Miller, a veteran lawman whose family owned a small dairy operation just south of the county line. Wayne grabbed his PA microphone, his amplified voice booming over the storm. Hawthorne, "Pull this monstrosity over right now. You are in violation of a dozen state transport laws. Pull over." Parker gripped the steering wheel. Stopping was a death sentence. If they lost their forward momentum on this slush-covered asphalt, they would never get 60,000 pounds moving again. The custom dolly was holding, but the welds were fatigued. Furthermore, if he shut off the 1206, it would never restart with the fuel line this low. Parker looked down at Wayne. The deputy's face was hard, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion. He was looking at the massive steel beam bolted to the front weight bracket, tracing it up to Dale's 806. Parker didn't reach for the brake. Instead, he pointed a stiff, freezing finger directly at the massive silver hopper trailer behind him, then tapped his wrist where his watch lay buried under layers of canvas. And finally, he mouthed one word with absolute, terrifying clarity. Bank. Wayne Miller kept pace beside the massive rear tire of the 1206. He looked at the trailer, reading the hand-painted Hawthorne Farms lettering on the side. He knew Parker. He knew the Hawthorne family had been fighting off foreclosure for 18 months. Every man sitting in the local diner knew that Henderson's midnight grain train was Parker's last lifeline. Wayne looked at the incredibly dangerous, completely illegal tandem hitch. He looked at Parker, whose face was covered in a frozen mix of grease, sleet, and soot, looking more like a ghost of the Dust Bowl than a modern man. The deputy slammed his hand against his steering wheel in frustration. He grabbed his radio, yelled something into it, and hit the brakes. Parker braced himself, waiting for the deputy to pull out a shotgun or aggressively cut in front of Dale to force a stop. Instead, the Plymouth Fury dropped back behind the massive trailer. The siren abruptly cut off, but the red and blue strobes remained intensely bright, bouncing off the falling snow. Wayne Miller aggressively swerved his cruiser so it straddled the center line, effectively blocking both lanes of Highway 34 from any approaching traffic. He wasn't pulling them over. He was acting as their rear guard. A heavy, freezing knot in Parker's chest momentarily loosened. He reached for the signal rope and gave it one firm, reassuring yank. "Keep pushing, Dale." At 11:15 p.m., the 1206's engine finally skipped. It was a hard, violent shudder that sent a shockwave right through the rigid steel beam. Up front, Dale felt the terrifying jerk and looked back. A puff of white smoke shot out of the 1206's exhaust, stacked the telltale sign of a diesel engine starving for fuel. "Don't you quit on me," Parker roared at the dashboard, slamming his open palm against the cowling. The engine surged, caught a splash of fuel sloshing in the bottom of the tank, and roared back to life. But it was running rough, misfiring on one cylinder. They were running on fumes and prayers, and they had just hit the Lincoln city limits. Entering the industrial outskirts of Lincoln brought a new kind of terror. The open highway had been dangerous, but it was a straight line. Now, they faced traffic lights, concrete curbs, and the tight, right-angle geometry of city streets. The snow was accumulating rapidly on the pavement, turning the intersections into slick, treacherous skating rinks. It was 11:35 p.m. They had 25 minutes to reach Henderson's grain elevators, located deep within the maze of the Union Pacific rail yard. As they approached the intersection of Cornhusker Highway and 11th Street, Parker's blood ran cold. The light was glowing a solid, unforgiving red. Normally, a truck driver would begin downshifting a quarter-mile out, gently applying the trailer's air brakes. Parker had no air brakes. The makeshift compressor tank was completely tapped out. He yanked the signal rope violently. "Brake! Brake!" Dale saw the red light. He stood on the mechanical drum brakes of the 806, locking the rear tires. Parker mirrored the action on the 1206. 12 tons of farm machinery went into a screaming, sliding skid on the ice-covered blacktop, completely overpowered by the 30 tons of wheat pushing them from behind. The intersection was rushing up to meet them. A late-night delivery truck was starting to pull out into the intersection from the cross street. Behind them, Deputy Miller saw the disaster unfolding. He gunned his cruiser into the oncoming lane, completely bypassing the massive rig, and slid his car sideways right into the middle of the intersection, his siren screaming to life. The delivery truck slammed on its brakes, sliding to a halt just feet away from the cruiser's door. Dale and Parker slid right through the red light, their massive tires leaving thick black streaks of melted rubber on the ice. They blew through the intersection at 15 miles an hour, missing the deputy's cruiser by a matter of feet. Jesus Almighty! Dale screamed to himself in the lead tractor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. They had survived the intersection, but the rail yard turnoff was only 3 blocks ahead. It was a sharp, 90-degree right turn onto an access road heavily lined with concrete drainage barriers. A standard semi-truck has a pivoting fifth wheel directly over its drive axles, allowing the cab to turn tightly while the trailer trails behind. But Parker and Dale were driving a 40-foot-long rigid battering ram. The steel beam connecting the two tractors meant they couldn't articulate. They had to take the turn as one massive, unbending unit. "Take it wide, Dale, wide," Parker yelled into the wind, though it was entirely useless. Dale knew what he had to do. As they approached the access road, he swung the 806 violently out into the left lane of the 4-lane street, pushing right up against the median. Parker watched the geometry of the turn forming and realized instantly it wasn't going to be enough. The custom-welded dolly carrying the front of the trailer was going to cut the corner too tight. It was going to slam directly into the 3-foot-high concrete barrier. As Dale cranked the wheel of the 806 hard to the right, beginning the pivot, Parker made a desperate, highly dangerous maneuver. He didn't steer the 1206 to follow Dale. Instead, he slammed his heavy boot down entirely on the left independent wheel brake. The left rear tire of the 1206 locked up tight. The right tire kept pulling under the massive engine torque. This essentially turned the rear tractor into a giant mechanical rudder. The extreme, asymmetric drag violently shoved the front of the trailer out to the left, forcing the dolly to swing wider into the intersection. Screech. The custom steel dolly scraped against the frozen concrete barrier, showering the snow-covered street in brilliant orange sparks. The horrible sound of grinding metal echoed off the brick warehouses lining the street. The half-inch structural steel Dale had welded hours ago groaned under the sheer shearing force, but the weld held. The dolly cleared the barrier by less than 2 inches. The massive trailer violently whipped around the corner, its tandem axles hopping over the curb and crushing a metal street sign flat into the mud. They were in the rail yard. Through the driving snow, illuminated by massive industrial halogen floodlights, stood the towering concrete silos of Thomas Henderson's grain elevator. And sitting on the tracks right beside it, its massive diesel locomotive idling with a deep, rhythmic thrum, was the Union Pacific freight train. Parker looked at his watch. 11:48 p.m. They had 12 minutes, but as the towering silos came into view, the 1206's engine let out one final, pitiful gasp, choked on air, and died completely. The sudden loss of power jerked the steel connecting beam, snapping Dale's head back as the entire rig lost its rear drive. The dead weight of the rear tractor and the trailer instantly acted as a massive anchor. They were 200 yards from the weighing scales, and Parker was completely out of gas. The sudden, deafening silence of the dead Farmall 1206 was more terrifying than the howling of the blizzard. The massive rig came to a grinding halt just 200 yards short of the weighing scales, the heavy trailer tires sinking slightly into the slush-covered access road. Parker Hawthorne sat frozen in the open-air cab, his hand still gripping the useless steering wheel. He looked at his watch. 11:49 p.m. 11 minutes. Up front, Dale Jenkins threw the Farmall 806 into neutral and left it idling. He climbed down, his boots splashing into the freezing slush, and ran back to the 1206. "What happened?" Dale screamed, his voice cracking from the cold and the adrenaline. "She sucked air," Parker yelled back, hitting the steering column with a heavy, frustrated fist. "Tank is bone dry. The grade chewed up our reserve. Can I pull it with the 806 alone?" Dale asked, already knowing the answer. "From a dead stop, on wet snow?" Parker shook his head, the bitter reality settling into his bones. "You don't have the weight. You'll just spin out, or worse, you'll snap the tow beam and tear your front axle off. It's over, Dale. We missed it by 200 yards. As the two men stared at the towering concrete silos of the grain elevator, mocking them in the halogen light, the heavy thwack of a car door slamming shut broke their despair. Deputy Wayne Miller trudged through the snow, his heavy winter uniform dusted with white. He walked the length of the massive hopper trailer, inspecting the custom-welded dolly and the rigid steel beam connecting the two tractors. He shook his head, a look of profound disbelief plastered across his weathered face. "Hawthorne," Wayne said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I've been a county deputy for 22 years. I have seen meth labs explode. I have seen cattle rustlers drive trucks into the river, and I have seen a man try to rob a bank with a chainsaw. But this is the most magnificently stupid thing I have ever laid eyes on. Write the tickets. Wayne, Parker muttered, his shoulders finally slumping. Reckless endangerment, operating an unregistered commercial vehicle, noise ordinance. Write 'em all. The bank gets the farm at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning anyway. I'll have plenty of time to sit in a cell. Wayne looked at the exhausted farmer, then looked at his watch. 11:50, 1 p.m. Henderson's train pulls out at 1, but the contract cutoff is midnight, isn't it? Yeah, Parker said softly. Wayne turned and looked back at his idling police cruiser. It was a 1,974 Plymouth Fury. Under the hood sat a 440 cubic inch Magnum V8, the legendary police interceptor engine, backed by a reinforced transmission and a heavy-duty steel push bumper designed for ramming fleeing vehicles off the highway. My old man lost his dairy farm to First National back in '68, Wayne said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a hard, dangerous edge. Banker didn't even have the decency to look him in the eye. Sent a kid in a cheap suit with a padlock. Wayne pointed a thick, leather-clad finger at Parker. Get back in that dead tractor, Hawthorne. Put the transmission in neutral. Steer it. Wayne, what are you doing? Dale asked, his eyes going wide. Jenkins, get back in the 806, the deputy barked, completely ignoring the question. Put her in your lowest crawler gear. When you hear my siren chirp, you dump the clutch and give her everything that cast iron block has left. Before either farmer could argue, Wayne jogged back to his cruiser. He threw it into gear and carefully maneuvered the heavy Plymouth behind the massive silver hopper trailer. He crept forward until the thick rubber pads of his heavy steel push bumper made solid contact with the steel DOT underride guard at the back of the trailer. Clunk. Parker felt the impact vibrate all the way through the trailer, through the fifth-wheel dolly, and into the frame of the dead 1,206. Inside the cruiser, Wayne rolled his window down. He turned off his flashing light bar to save the alternator, shifted the heavy transmission into low gear, and planted his left foot firmly on the brake while his right foot pressed the accelerator. The massive 440 Magnum engine roared to life, a deep, guttural Detroit iron snarl that echoed off the brick warehouses. Whoop whoop, the siren chirped. Up front, Dale Jenkins gritted his teeth, muttered a prayer to whatever patron saint watched over desperate fools, and popped the clutch on the 806 while burying the throttle. Simultaneously, Wayne Miller sidestepped the brake pedal in the Plymouth and buried the gas pedal into the floor mat. The Plymouth's rear tires instantly broke traction on the slushy asphalt, spinning wildly and kicking up a massive rooster tail of ice and dirty water. The rear end of the police cruiser fishtailed violently, threatening to slide off the back of the trailer. Up front, the 806's massive agricultural lugs bit into the icy road, slipping, grabbing, slipping again. The engine howled against the governor. For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing moved. It was a stalemate of horsepower against physics. 70,000 pounds of dead weight sat immovable in the freezing slush. "Come on, you son of a bitch!" Wayne screamed inside the cruiser, violently feathering the throttle, trying to find the exact threshold of traction. The smell of vaporized rubber and burning transmission fluid filled the air. Then Parker felt it. A shudder, a groan of tortured steel. The dead 1,206 lurched forward an inch, then 2. "Keep it straight, Parker," Dale roared from the lead tractor, though Parker couldn't hear him over the screaming V8 of the police car pushing them from behind. With agonizing slowness, the unholy train began to roll. 1 mile an hour, 2 miles an hour. Wayne kept the heavy steel bumper pinned to the back of the trailer, his rear tires constantly slipping and catching, the engine screaming at 5,000 RPMs. Dale led the way, his 806 churning a path through the slush, the heavy steel connecting beam dragging the dead 1,206 like a stubborn mule. They crawled past the first row of elevators. 11, 54 PM. The rail workers, men who had spent their entire lives around heavy machinery, stopped dead in their tracks. A half-dozen men in heavy canvas coats and hard hats stood in the freezing rain, their jaws dropping as they witnessed a police cruiser pushing a commercial semi-trailer that was chained to a dead tractor, which was being dragged by a second tractor. "Clear the pad," somebody yelled. They were 50 yards from the massive concrete ramp of the elevator scales. "Don't lift, Dale. Don't lift," Parker prayed, his hands locked in a death grip on the steering wheel, fighting to keep the dead 1,206 perfectly aligned behind the 806, so they didn't snap the tow beam and crush the whole operation. At 11:57 p.m., the front tires of Dale's 806 hit the incline of the concrete scale pad. The extra resistance nearly stalled the tractor, but the massive push from Wayne's Plymouth forced it up and over the lip. The custom dolly clattered onto the heavy steel plates of the commercial scale. The hopper trailer followed, groaning under the immense weight. Wayne slammed on his brakes, putting the cruiser in park before it hit the scale itself. Dale pushed the clutch in, bringing the front tractor to a halt. The rig stopped dead center on the massive industrial scale. Parker looked at his watch. 11:58 p.m. The door to the scale house slammed open. Harlan, the night foreman, came storming out into the blizzard, his face purple with rage. He was a stickler for the rules, a man who lived and died by DOT regulations. "What the hell is this?" Harlan screamed over the howling wind, pointing a clipboard at the monstrosity sitting on his scale. "You can't bring farm equipment on the commercial scales. That's an illegal setup. I am not stamping a weigh ticket for a load pulled by a circus act." Parker jumped down from the dead 1,206. His legs were shaking so badly he nearly collapsed into the slush, but the adrenaline kept him upright. He marched over to the side of the trailer and began furiously cranking the heavy landing gear down. "Parker Hawthorne?" A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. A tall man in a heavy wool overcoat stepped out from the shadow of the scale house. It was Thomas Henderson, the grain broker himself. He had been waiting for the midnight cutoff to finalize the train's manifest. Henderson walked slowly around the rig. He looked at the smoking Plymouth cruiser, gave Deputy Miller a long, calculating look, and then walked up to the custom-welded dolly sitting over the fifth wheel. He reached out and touched the massive steel I-beam Dale had cut from the Hawthorne barn. "Henderson," Parker panted, his breath ragged. 60,000 pounds of premium winter wheat. Contract stipulated it had to be on the scales by midnight. "This is an uninsurable liability, Parker," Henderson said quietly, his eyes scanning the exhausted, soot-stained farmer. "If you had wrecked this on Highway 34, it would have been on the 6 o'clock news for a week. But I didn't," Parker replied, his voice hard as iron. "Is my wheat here or not?" Harlan crossed his arms. "Mr. Henderson, I can't weigh a coupled trailer if the tractor isn't legal. The scale computer won't accept the axle distribution." "Then uncouple it," Parker barked. Dale ran back with the heavy sledgehammer. He crawled under the dripping, freezing custom dolly and knocked the locking pin out of the fifth wheel. Parker finished cranking the landing gear until the trailer was entirely supporting its own weight. Dale jumped into the 806, dumped the clutch, and dragged the dead 1,206 and the dolly completely off the scale pad, leaving only the massive silver hopper trailer sitting on the weighing plates. "Weigh the trailer, Harlan," Henderson ordered. Not taking his eyes off Parker, Harlan grumbled, retreating into the warm scale house. A moment later, the heavy dot matrix printer inside began to screech. Harlan emerged, holding a white ticket with carbon copy backing. "Gross weight, 72,450 pounds, Harlan read aloud, subtracting the tare weight of a standard 40-foot hopper. "That's 61,200 pounds of wheat." Henderson took the ticket. He pulled a heavy silver pocket watch from his vest. 11:59 p.m., Henderson announced. He pulled a pen from his coat and signed the bottom of the weigh ticket with a flourish. He ripped the top copy off and handed it to Parker. "The contract is fulfilled, Parker," Henderson said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile breaking through his stern facade. "I'll have the check cut by 7:00 a.m. It will be waiting for you at the front desk." Parker took the piece of paper. It felt heavier than the trailer he had just dragged 40 miles. He looked at Dale, who was leaning against the tire of the 806, smoking a severely bent cigarette. He looked at Deputy Wayne Miller, who gave a sharp, two-finger salute before climbing back into his battered cruiser and pulling away into the night. "Henderson," Parker said, his voice finally cracking. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, Hawthorne," Henderson replied, turning back toward the silos. "I didn't hitch 2 tractors together and drag 30 tons of grain through a blizzard. You earned every penny of this. Now get this scrap metal out of my rail yard before the daytime DOT inspectors show up and arrest us all." At 8:01 a.m. the following morning, Parker Hawthorne walked through the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank of Omaha. He was still wearing his soot-stained canvas coat, his boots leaving clumps of dried, frozen clay on the pristine marble floor. He walked straight to the branch manager's desk, ignoring the secretary, and slapped a certified cashier's check down on the polished mahogany. It covered the mortgage, the late fees, and next year's seed capital in full. The manager, who had the foreclosure papers already sitting in his outbox, simply stared at the check in stunned silence. The Hawthorne farm was safe. They say out in Otoe County, if you drive down Highway 34 just after a hard freeze, you can still feel the ghost of a vibration in the blacktop, the lingering memory of 12 tons of cast iron and a desperate man's willpower. The legend of the twin Farmalls became a localized myth, a story whispered over black coffee in diners from Lincoln to Omaha, whenever the subject of corporate foreclosure rears its ugly head. Parker Hawthorne never spoke of it to the local papers. maintaining a stoic silence until the day he died. But hanging from the heavy rafters in Dale Jenkins's machine shop, suspended by heavy logging chains for all to see, is a massive, incredibly ugly fifth-wheel dolly welded out of scrap iron and a barn beam. It serves as a permanent, ironclad reminder that while money talks and mudholts progress, nothing on earth is more dangerous or unstoppable than a farmer with his back against the wall.